We have Matt Vidal here today to talk about his pretty recent book. Is it 2022?
Yeah.
2022 book, Management Divided, Contradictions of Labor Management, which is about American manufacturing has integrated the kind of lean or TPS type manufacturing methods or philosophy. So, Matt, do you want to tell us a little bit about the book then?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Tom. Yeah, it's a bit difficult to figure out where to start. It's a big book. It was a big project, and it's got a lot of arguments in it. But I guess so. The book came out of my PhD research, where I went in to study manufacturing work organization. And so I was interested in, as a sociologist or budding sociologist, I was interested in one of the main theories of sociology of work is called labor process theory. That's a term from Marx. Marx referred to the work-employment relationship as the labor process. And that was kind of my way into Marxism, was looking at labor management and employment relations. And I had this opportunity to go in and study a bunch of manufacturers. So that was in the early 2000s. The research was actually completed a while ago, in the early 2000s. And the big buzz then was in not just in Marxism, but in sociology of work and employment relations and human resource management more generally, was various so-called post-Fordist models of labor management, which were supposed to increase, depending on there was a debate, of course, but one side of the debate said that these models increase employee involvement and worker participation and upskill the workers. And so there's a debate here, and lean production emerges as the lean, of course, comes from the Toyota production system. It begins to diffuse out of Japan into the into North America and Western Europe in the 90s. And pretty much by the end of the 90s, every manufacturer is doing lean production. There used to be some other models, like they used to refer to, for example, the Volvo model, where they got rid of an assembly line and had workers assembling an entire car as a team in a stationary thing they called the dock. But eventually that didn't work well enough, and Volvo adopted lean production, and everybody adopted lean production. And the big debate was, are the advocates right that lean production is actually empowering workers? And this, of course, was a big contested word, empowerment. It was empowering them through multi-skilling and cross-training and participation in problem-solving and decision-making. And then there were the critics, led by Marxist scholars, who said, no, it's all bullshit. The workers are not being upskilled. If you see workers being cross-trained, actually they're just being multitasked. They're being trained in very simple tasks, and they don't have any real substantive decision-making power when they're involved in problem-solving and decision-making. And this critique that I always loved, which comes out of both Marxists and out of the labor movement, is that, well, if they ask workers to give their ideas, it's all just about increasing profit. It's not about improving work. And my thought on that was, well, of course it's about increasing profit. These are capitalist firms. Why else would they do it? But anyway, so I came into that, and I was a Marxist, or a budding Marxist. And so when I went into the field, I expected to find what the Marxists had said, is that lean production is all about, is that there's no empowerment. What it actually does is it's actually a form of further de-skilling of workers and a form of work intensification.
So when you say a further sense of de-skilling, in what sense would it be further than, say, a Fordist approach? What was the argument?
Yeah, right. So the Fordists, so going back, so Ford and Taylor, Fordism and Taylorism are very closely related. Taylor, Frederick Winslow Taylor, of course, introduced this idea that is known as scientific management. And that was very clearly a de-skilling approach. What they did was what Taylorism is you break the work down into its simplest possible components, and then you standardize these. And then individuals just do one thing. And so this is the image of the person in the factory where all they do is do rivets all day long. Or they're doing the same thing over and over and over. And it's a highly detailed division of labor where most of the workers are doing very simple tasks, which you can come off the street without a high school education and learn to do it. So that was de-skilling, and Taylorism went along with Fordism, which was a kind of a supply-driven approach. Ford is often associated with the assembly line, but it was really more importantly than that was it was a system based on economies of scale, where they forecast how much can we make, and they pumped out as many standardized goods as they could to try and achieve economies of scale. So this is a good question, Tom. How could, given this context of de-skilled workers under Taylorism, how could you get more de-skilled under lean? It's not clear to me how you could get more de-skilled, but I think the argument, maybe it's not increasing de-skilling, but it's continued de-skilling. But what lean production brings, according to the critics, is an extreme level of work intensification.
Right. So the real point behind, so the way they were to get to more higher profitability was by, the old fashioned increasing the intensity of the labor. That was the overriding, principle.
That's the argument of the critics. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And I trying not to jump around here, but I mean, my own view now, after having studied lean production for 20 years and published extensively on it, is that lean production. So the advocates say lean production makes you work smarter, not harder. And the critics say it just makes you work harder. And it can do both. So the set of tools of lean production, the just-in-time production system in particular, one thing that it does is it eliminates buffers in the system. So it used to be that under the Fordist system, all of the phases of constructing a product, say a car, for example, you did stamping in one department, you did machining in another department, you did painting in another department, you did welding in another, and these were all completely separated. And every time it went from your station, it went back into inventory. And the system was not very well connected. And so there were lots of buffers in the system, which means that the workers had a lot of time for rest and recuperation because of these buffers in the production system. So just in time does eliminate those buffers by going to continuous flow production or cellular production, whereby they have all of the things you need to make the part in the same location, and there's no breaks in between them. So it does have the potential to greatly intensify work, but my argument is that is not inherent to lean production. And what's critical is the managerial orientation. And so we can get into the role of managers and a Marxist understanding of managers later. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to argue that middle managers they're not just pure agents of capital, and they have some discretion, and they have to think about things other than maximizing the exploitation of labor. They also need to think about things like quality control, flexibility, continuous improvement. They need to think about the broader division of labor. And so my argument is that managers have the ability, depending on the context, to use lean production, to implement lean production in a way that does not lead to work intensification. So just two more points on this. One is that the tools that lean production uses for work intensification are basically classical Taylorist tools. Time and motion study, and one of the Taylor's contemporaries, Frank Gilbreth, he introduced process mapping in the 1920s. And so that's essentially what lean does. They call it value stream mapping now. And so you can definitely map a production process such that you take out any buffer in the production process and increase. So you can use it for de-skilling, but lean production is about more than that de-skilling. And so what I say to the critics is that the critics say lean production is pure exploitation and intensification and nothing else. And I say, well, how could Toyota have taken over global market share in the very impressive way that it did simply by ever more exploiting workers ever more intensely? And my argument is that it can't. It took over the global market because it also has capabilities not just for work intensification, but for improved quality control and for continuous improvement. And the way that you get improved quality control and continuous improvement is actually by giving your workers some skills and some empowerment to contribute in ways that aren't just ever more sweating them. So when I went into the field, I expected to see what the Marxists of my time had been saying, which was that all managers would be completely preoccupied with intensifying work ever more intense, and that workers would be, therefore, because they are alienated under this system, and because they would withdraw and they would try to minimize their effort as much as possible. So you've got this control resistance dynamic. Managers are controlling, ever more control, and workers are resisting. But it just didn't reflect what I saw when I went into 31 factories. I interviewed about 109 people, including something like 40 managers and something like 60 workers, and then various union reps. And none of the managers that I met were preoccupied with ever more work intensification. They were actually preoccupied with trying to upskill and train their workers and involve them in decision making. Now, not all of them, but some of them. And the workers, by the same token, they weren't just trying to resist, but they really wanted to make their work meaningful. And they tried really hard to be good, productive workers. And so given this, I had to either abandon Marxism, or I had to dig deeply into Marxism and try to understand this in a way that, and so I ended up developing a, not my own, based on others, based on a lot of work of others. I developed an alternative interpretation. And so what we can call the kind of standard Marxist interpretation of sociology of work and labor process theory is the Bravermanian one from Harry Braverman. And Harry Braverman said that that the overriding priority of managers is to maximize the exploitation and control of labor. And what I did is I went back into a more, what fellow colleagues and I call a more classical Marxist interpretation of Marx, what we call classical Marxism, where we see this de-skilling, this Bravermanian de-skilling as a dominant tendency within the 19th and 20th centuries in the organization of work. But we see alongside it a contradictory tendency, which is a tendency toward the upskilling of labor to extract from workers not just physical effort, but actually skills and creative input and discretionary effort.
Right. So you have this like contradiction, like inbuilt, that at the same time that the craft workers were getting, their crafts were being destroyed by, modern industry that Marx is writing in volume 1. But at the same time, the needs for capitalists, for workers that could read and write, which previously perhaps didn't exist, with these counter tendencies going on of de-skilling of workers, but also upgrading the skills. We see workers today, they need to know how to use a phone and they need to know how to read and write. There might be lots of separate things they need to know. Government regulations or something, right?
Well, and even the use of computers, right? So they have to use computers. And my colleague Paul Adler talks about how more than that, they have to have knowledge of how to interact in a complex, interdependent labor process. So my analysis is deeply rooted in Marx's Capital Volume 1. And I spent years reading this over and over again to try and come up with a different interpretation than what the Bravermanians had. And the first most important point is that Marx, contradiction was a central element of human relations and human development. And he argued that among the most fundamental contradictions of human society is a contradiction between the forces of production and the relations of production. And so the forces of production, we can say the forces of production, and here it gets a little, we need to get a little nuanced here too, because we might think of the forces of production as technology, but really for Marx, the fundamental force of production for Marx was human labor. And so at root, the forces of production is not some disembodied technology, but it's human creativity itself. So for Marx, the fundamental force of production was human labor, and specifically human cooperation and the division of labor. He was very critical about the detailed division of labor that happened and so this is where he gets his theory of alienation, is that when you're in a detailed division of labor where you're only doing a very simple task over and over every day, and you have no connection to the thing as a whole product, and you have no connection to the overall process and no connection to your fellow workers, then you become alienated. But that was his theory of how capitalism was during the stages. So he has a stage theory of development, and he said you go from this craft production into something that he called manufacture, which is the division of labor in a factory using hand tools. And then he said you go to large scale production, which is the division of labor with machine tools and power tools. And then he actually theorized in elements. There's a passage in Capital where he theorizes how this is only going to be useful for so long, and at some point there's going to have to be a return to multi-skilled workers, to workers who have multiple skills. And that's a really prescient thing that Marx wrote in the 1860s, sort of anticipating multi-skilling, which didn't even happen until 100 years later. So that's the forces of production, and that's one factor in the development of human society and human societal development. So the forces of production are first and foremost labor and the division of labor and human cooperation, but also science and technology. And technology, in this understanding, simply being the practical application of scientific knowledge. So that's one. But then he talked about the relations of production, and this distinguishes his modes of production from the slave-based society, which relations of production were slave-based, to the feudal society, in which relations of production were based on the relationship between the lord and the serf being being stuck in the land of the lord and having to do what the lord said by virtue of custom and tradition. And then the capitalist mode of production, which is the labor management relationship of today under the labor market. And the argument is that this contradiction between the relations of production or the class structure of society and the forces of production is driving technological development. Marx argued that the pre-capitalist relations of production, they fettered technological development, which is to say they blocked technological development for various reasons that we can go into. Then when capitalism eventually emerged, first in the countryside in Western Europe, when feudal lords started employing wage labor, and then the wage labor relationship comes in, and the argument is that once private property develops, contemporary private property and the profit motive, that gives some sort of super steroidal boost to the development of the forces of production. And that's why we have such rapid technological development over the last 150 years, but the relationship remains contradictory. And Marx expected that at some point, capitalist relations of production would fetter the further development of the forces of production. And we think we can see that very clearly today. For example, this is way out of the book doesn't go into this, but in the climate crisis, we have a climate crisis. And why are we not developing more renewables? Because the renewables aren't profitable. And so the technological development that we could have to develop a sort of degrowth economy or a green growth economy is being blocked or fettered because it's not profitable enough for capitalism. The profit motive is the domain of the relations of production, of capitalist class relations. And I make an argument that the forces of production have there's an independent motive. There's a relative autonomy to the forces of production, which is driven by what we might call an engineering motive or an efficiency motive. And my argument against some Bravermanians is that a lot of people, and so we can make this concrete. The Bravermanians would say that engineers who developed lean production developed it exclusively with controlling labor in mind. And my argument is no, they didn't. They were actually engineers who weren't class warriors, and they weren't totally preoccupied with controlling labor. They actually wanted to improve efficiency for its own right. And I think we need to distinguish efficiency as such from the profit motive. They were interested in developing a production system that could be more flexible and that could improve quality. And in order to do this, they needed to harness the creativity and skills of workers. And hence, that's why I'm arguing that I still think the dominant tendency is still one of de-skilling, because in most cases, managers do just prioritize profit over any sort of dynamic efficiency and capability. But in a small number of cases, and that's what I found in the book. So the majority of the companies that I studied just did a kind of Tayloristic approach, a descaling approach, but a small number of the managers had the correct orientation, where they said, you know what, let's really upskill these workers and give them. And I've got some examples in the book of factory managers saying, I want these workers to be self-managed on the floor, managing their own. And so that's again why I was just trying to explain that from a Marxist perspective.
So like it's very interesting, like there is this constant tension within capitalist firms between people who want to solve the problems in this engineering sense, make the thing more efficient in a kind of a output per input, right? And then there's also usually sometimes the people that are doing that don't have actually kind of responsibility for profit. Sometimes they do, right? And how the profit interacts with that, it's just a deep contradiction in capital.
Yeah. And so there's a magisterial book on this by a historian called David Noble, and the book is called Forces of Production.
I've actually read that book about 10 years ago. Yeah, randomly. I was reading your book. I was going, oh, finally, here's something I've read. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a fantastic book. It's really interesting, but I basically disagree with his core thesis. I think almost everything else is right, but his argument is that all engineers are basically class warriors, and the design of machine tools has been designed to de-skill labor. What I think he shows that these engineers are just really kind of obsessed with efficiency. But I think he conflates that efficiency with profitability and with profit motive and controlling labor. So I think this is important because for most Marxists, they just assume efficiency means minimizing labor costs. But that's a very short-term, narrow version of efficiency. And I insist that as Marxists, especially as Marxists who are concerned about climate crisis, and I think this will tie into your stuff, Tom, on planning too as well. As Marxists, I think we have to recover efficiency from the capitalists, and we have to say there are forms of there's one way, there's short-term efficiency, short-term cost-cutting efficiency, but then there's more longer-term dynamic forms of efficiency. And in a burning world, in a world that's burning, literally burning from climate change, the efficient use of socialists have to embrace efficiency as a concept. We're going to have to efficiently produce, and this gets into some degrowth stuff, right? We're going to have to efficiently produce in a way that's not wasteful. And so there are things about reducing waste from lean production that we can take, and we can reclaim efficiency in a way that separates it from just seeing efficiency as minimizing labor costs.
Right. Well, it's inherent in, Marx's idea of, modes of production, that the next mode of production is more, it's more efficient on some
right.
sense, right? That it can't be the next mode of production if it's not more efficient, because it'll just get outcompeted. Look what happened to the Soviet Union. It was less efficient, right? And so it had to die, It's just a truism. Like, if socialism is to be a mode of production, it just has to be more efficient than capitalism. It's just the way it is. There's some very interesting stuff. You go into it in there about like these contradictions between this short-termism and this long-term thinking that motivates the management. There's all of these different things. It's not simply you're trying to control and bash the head of the worker and make them work faster. There's multiple, it's a multi-dimensional forces upon the manager in these situations that makes them, try to, in which they operate. Let's put it like that. So if we think literally about, say, a producer, say a firm, and they're producing a component for, say, another firm's, like that firm exists within this, large chain of being for the top firm who's creating these things. And it's not simply cost that they will choose that firm upon, because there's all sorts of risks around changing suppliers and everything. So there's many, many different forces determining the actual structure of production.
Yeah, and I mean, and they want, and in many cases, they want suppliers with high capabilities, including for quality and flexibility. So there's two things I want to, based on what you said, I think I need to be clear here that in many cases, managers are overwhelmingly obsessed with maximizing the exploitation of workers and minimizing labor control. So I don't want to be misunderstood here. We could talk about Walmart or some of the other, Walmart as the biggest employer in the U.S. I mean, that's systematic, or Amazon as one of the biggest employers. These workplaces are terrible places to work because the managers are overwhelmingly prioritizing short-term cost cutting and work intensification and indeed union busting, right? So this vision, yes, that is true. But what I'm saying is that within management, capitalist management as a whole, there are divisions, and that's why the book is titled Management Divided. And management is divided in two ways. One, that there are a small number of managers who are willing to fully empower their workforce in self-directed or empowered teams. And the other one is that the managers themselves, they face conflicting logics. So one logic of labor management is Taylorism, descale and standardize and intensify. And another one is the empowerment logic. And most managers probably do think through the Taylorist lens, but we need to acknowledge for our proper understanding of the economy and the society that there is a counter tendency to this dominant tendency. I do think that descaling, work intensification, and managerial control of labor is the dominant tendency. But what this minor tendency of some managers actually adopting an empowerment approach, what we're seeing here is we're seeing socialism being born in the womb of capitalism. And then, so my final argument is that, not my final, but a final argument here is that when managers are adopting this de-skilling rather than this upskilling approach, in most cases, they're being very inefficient. They're producing inefficiency in their firms. And if capitalist management is increasingly producing inefficient organizations, then it loses some of its legitimacy. Why do we need managers? We don't actually. We don't need capitalist managers anymore. Now, coming back to what you were talking about earlier about we have a highly educated working class. This highly educated and highly capable working class is capable of self-managing their own firms. And my counterfactual is that a self-managed worker firm is going to be a lot more efficient in a dynamic long-term sense than a capitalist firm.
Right. So I have a question for you here. When we get into these are very interesting points about like why in particular types of industries do managers take, an intensification versus an empowerment one. I remember 10 years ago, Google offices, they'd have a slide down to the canteen, right? Yeah. In Amazon, if you're a delivery guy, you got to bring a bottle so you can piss in it because they don't give you a chance to take a break, right?
Yep.
Now, is there a correlation kind of broadly in here between the types of labor the type of work that's being performed and the type of approach? So for example, maybe a driver or a delivery guy, maybe it's quite low skill. Everybody can drive a car these days and you're just delivering a package versus, working in the software industry where I've worked in a while, and it's more cerebral, or even in a factory where you're a machine toolist and it's actually quite skilled, semi-skilled to skilled, that they take an empowerment approach. Are we seeing this? Is that a broad tendency or is it more mixed?
Yeah, good question. I think in general, there is a correlation with occupational skill levels. So I've actually been working over the last 2 weeks on some papers on software development. So this is fresh in my head. My view here is that in the highly skilled occupations, such as software development, where the workers have a high level of not only skill but tacit knowledge, and the managers have trouble codifying and extracting all that tacit knowledge and skill, then this gives workers an element of power in the labor management relation, and it therefore makes managers more likely to adopt an empowerment approach. So in a study, I have a study from one of my PhD students, Ian Hill, that we've been working on this week, or the last 2 weeks. And he interviewed 13 software developing teams in 13 different companies. And 10 of them adopted an empowerment approach. And 3 of them adopted a more standardized Taylorist approach. So I do think that still at the end of the day, what really matters is the managerial orientation. But that can be shaped very much by the context. And in a high scale occupational context, my expectation is that you're going to get more likely to see an empowerment approach than a de-skilling approach. And then if we take it down to a semi-skilled context, such as manufacturing, you're more likely to see a de-skilling approach than an empowerment approach, though you will still have some managers who will empower. And then if we take it down to the kind of really low skilled stuff, you're going to overwhelmingly see a de-skilling, low-cost approach.
This is getting back to the efficiency stuff. You break down into kind of 4 general kind of lean approaches, a kind of, what do we say? There's like the highest one is like high empowered workers.
Yeah.
Then we have a kind of a lean standardization approach. Then we have a kind of an autonomous worker approach, not so much standardization. And finally, a kind of just
lean enough.
Lean enough, just pick and choose certain techniques. That's what actually, like the high empowered with standardization approach is the most optimal, most productive, most efficient approach. How much evidence is there for that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very unfashionable argument, because almost universally within the sociology of work and employment relations and HRM, it's an article of faith that there is no one best way. No one best way. There's multiple fine ways, which just seems totally unreasonable to me, because we saw that Fordist Taylorism diffused across the globe. Let's just limit it to manufacturing for the moment. Every manufacturer in the world from, say, 1940 to 1970 did Fordist Taylorism. Everyone. Now, when people started responding to that, when flexibility and quality when competition started being about flexibility and quality and not just cost, then at first you have job enrichment and job enlargement, and then you have self-directed teams, and you have all these other things. And it was in this context that people said, no, there's no one best way, because in Germany they do it this way, and in France they do it this way. But again, from 1990 to the present, every manufacturer in the world does lean production. But now this is where my 2x2 table comes in. On one dimension, it's whether you have empower your workers or not. And on the other dimension, it's whether you adopt lean production as a system of complementary practices, or whether you just adopt it as a toolbox. You adopt a couple of the easy ones, but not the hard ones. And my argument is that the best practice for overall dynamic efficiency, for efficiency with continuous improvement and flexibility and quality, in manufacturing at least, is adopting the lean system with a highly empowered workforce. Now, the evidence, I mean, I have a lot of evidence, a lot of qualitative evidence in my book, where that's just about the capabilities that these companies with the highly empowered workers have. They have high levels of capabilities that the other ones don't, in terms of quality and continuous improvement. But there's 2 bases of evidence in the literature just on lean production. There's robust evidence across multiple studies that the more you have the full complementary set of practices, the better the performance. And there's a lot of evidence on that, and the evidence almost universally supports that. The more comprehensive you implement lean, the better it is. And then there's a longer literature on the impact of employee involvement. And there's multiple meta studies of loads of studies. And these also, there's robust evidence that if you have substantive participation, if you have workers involved in problem solving and decision making, then that's going to improve performance more than either low levels of consultative participation or no participation. So putting those 2 together, basically I put those 2 together, and then I present dozens and dozens of pages of qualitative evidence of these companies. And I do have some quantitative performance evidence from my companies, but not much. But the statistical evidence clearly shows that lean production as a system is more efficient than any other form. And the quantitative evidence shows that high levels of worker substantive participation produces in performance improvement.
So this is like really good for like, us good commie socialists, is that, we see that the less alienated the worker is, the more productive the company is.
Yeah.
Right. And that says something deep about like the relations of production in capitalism being an actual fetter on the forces of production.
Absolutely.
Right? It's a deep point.
Yeah, and it comes back to this point about socialism being born in the womb of capitalism too, which was another argument that Marx made. Increasingly, the workers are able to manage the companies themselves, and the more you give them, you empower them to do that, and the more the managers stay out of the way, the more dynamically efficient these companies are going to be. So they're going to have not just short-term costs, but they're going to have the capability for long-term continuous improvement, and they're going to have the capability for high levels of flexibility and quality.
So getting back then a little bit towards the idea of alienation, this kind of what you would say, like from the literature, the kind of after Harry Braverman, this kind of approach whereby, the worker is inherently hostile and alienated within capitalist production. But that seems like, from your research and, from my own lived experience as being a worker in capitalism, is quite a crude way of understanding it. Do you want to talk a bit about like how the workers viewed, say, lean and more empowered, or even just the kind of problem solving elements, and how that alienation played out in reality for the workers in these scenarios?
Yeah. So the background here is that Harry Braverman, in his foundational 1974 book, he argued that the general understanding of Marx on alienation is that whenever a worker is in a capitalist employment relation, they will always be uniformly alienated. But Marx himself gives 4 reasons why alienation happens: separation from the product, separation from the process, separation from workers, and separation from one's own species being, is what he called it, because you're no longer doing work for yourself. You're no longer doing work that you've creatively planned yourself, but you're doing someone else's work. My reading was always that if you have 4 dimensions contributing to alienation, if you remove one of those, you should be less alienated. So if the worker gets more control over her work, she might be less alienated. Now, Braverman says that because workers are always alienated, I can quote this off the top of my head. This is a direct quote from Braverman. They surrender any interest in the labor process. So because you're alienated, you have no interest. And therefore, the vision from Braverman is that workers will try to minimize their effort as much as possible. And then this gets repeated by other huge foundational contributions. Richard Edwards, in his Contested Terrain, makes the exact same argument. William Lazonick, in his first labor process book, makes the exact same argument. And so it's repeated over and over that you should expect the workers, because they're alienated, to minimize their effort. But when I went in, and again, also based on my own work as a worker, I never tried to minimize my effort. I tried to do a good job. I tried to make my work interesting. But when I went in there, I was shocked by how almost all of the workers. So I interviewed 59 workers across the 31 companies, and the workers all were interested in doing a really good job, trying to make their work as meaningful as possible and trying to work as hard as they could to do a good job, because they cared about the product. And they were working as a team with their fellow workers, and they wanted to produce a good product. And in some cases, they even identified with the company. Now, a Bravermanian analysis would say that's all false consciousness, and they've been duped. But I don't think that's fair to the workers, and I think it makes them look like dupes, but they're not. And so what I did was I tried to understand this. I went back to Marx on alienation, and the beginning of Marx's the basis of Marx's theory of alienation is Marx's theory of species being. And for Marx, what species being means is that what makes humans humans. This goes back to Marx's famous example of the bee and the spider, right? The spider weaves he says, so this is a paraphrase, the spider weaves a web that will put to shame many an architect, and the bee with its honeycombs. But what's different is that they didn't plan it beforehand. So what makes humans human is the ability to plan something in your head and then realize that through your labor. And then you become alienated because you lose control over your labor and you're not planning it. But my reading is that, so Braverman's reading is that therefore that completely extinguishes your species being. And my reading is no, actually workers still have that. They still have this desire to want to make their work meaningful. And so I think this is a response to alienation is not withdraw from work. It's try and make the best of your work and do the best you can, even if you're in a de-skilled environment and your boss is a dick.
Right. Yeah, no, I've recently bought a few books by this. He's a British kind of management consultant guy. I don't know. He's like is applying lean to services, a guy called John Seddon. I don't know if you've heard of this guy.
Oh, no, I don't. I'll have to get the name. I'll have to get the reference after.
But it was very interesting. He was like basically trying to apply pull production or, the TPS or lean or whatever we want to places kind of like call centers and stuff like this, right?
Yeah.
And he was finding that, like, a lot of times the processes were, totally badly managed. They were trying to minimize like the call time. And what would happen is, say if it took 10 minutes to resolve a call, but if you did more than 5 minutes, you get in trouble. Workers would just hang up after 4 minutes, 59 seconds, right?
Yeah.
And this would actually cause massive turnover in the workforce because they go, this is bullshit, right? I can't even do a decent job. And when they actually reorganized the work and made it work in a decent way, like people there was less absenteeism, people would work more, they would find more connection with work. So it's like this idea that, like, if Braverman was writing that kind of a scenario, the worker would be like, say, I can just hang up on them after 4 minutes 59 because that'll be bad for capital and that'll be good for me in my relation, right? But it's the opposite is the fact. Like it says something deep about there's something deeply alienating about doing work that is pointless on some level.
Yes, exactly. And this, we probably don't need to get into it, but that's a much better analysis of that than Graeber on bullshit jobs. But let's leave that aside for now. Yeah, and I think you're totally right on that. And in addition, it illustrates this other point that I was making, that they think that the managers think that they were reducing short-term costs by having this 5-minute thing, but it was pumping in so many other costs into their system that it was just totally inefficient from any sort of midterm perspective, rather than building in capabilities, longer term capabilities.